Laura Mitchell stood by the kitchen window as the early evening light faded over the quiet street outside her home in Vermont. The house was silent in a way that still felt strange to her. For more than 20 years, the rooms had always been filled with small sounds, Daniel humming while making coffee, the television playing softly in the background, the steady rhythm of their daily life. Now, those sounds were gone. 6 months had passed since Daniel's sudden heart attack, but to Laura, it still felt unreal. Some mornings, she woke up expecting to hear his footsteps coming down the hallway. When the silence returned instead, the pain hit her all over again. The house had never felt this large before. Every room carried a memory. The living room reminded her of winter nights when Daniel would sit on the couch telling stories while Ethan laughed beside him. The kitchen reminded her of Sunday mornings when Daniel insisted on cooking pancakes, even though he always made a mess. The porch swing outside reminded her of warm summer evenings when they watched the sunset together. Those memories were beautiful, but they also hurt. They reminded her that the man who had shared her life for 23 years was suddenly gone. During the first weeks after the funeral, Laura barely left the house. Friends and neighbors from town brought food and flowers, but she often didn't answer the door. Some days she sat in the same chair for hours, holding Daniel's old sweater and staring at the floor. Grief moved slowly through her heart, heavy and exhausting. She didn't know how to live without the person who had been beside her for most of her adult life. But there was one person who refused to let her face everything alone. Her son, Ethan. When Ethan received the phone call about his father's death, he had been living in Boston and working his first serious job after college. Without hesitation, he packed his bags, spoke to his manager, and drove back home the next day. He told his mother it would only be temporary, but deep down he knew she needed someone with her. Ethan was 24 years old, tall like his father and quiet in a similar way. He had inherited Daniel's calm personality, while Laura's emotions often showed clearly on her face. Ethan usually stayed steady, even during difficult moments. That calm strength became the support Laura didn't realize she needed. He didn't try to give long speeches about grief. Instead, he helped in simple ways. Every morning he woke up early and made coffee before Laura came downstairs. Sometimes he cooked breakfast even though he wasn't very skilled in the kitchen. The first time he tried making eggs, he burned them badly and filled the kitchen with smoke. Laura almost laughed through her tears when she saw his embarrassed face. I guess Dad was better at this, Ethan admitted while opening the windows. The small moment of humor didn't erase the sadness, but it made the house feel human again. At night, Ethan cooked dinner, washed the dishes, and cleaned the kitchen. When Laura sat quietly in the living room, staring at the family photos on the wall, Ethan would sit nearby with a book or his laptop. He didn't always speak, but his presence filled the empty space that Daniel had left behind. One evening, Laura finally broke down completely. She had found an old photograph of Daniel in the hallway closet. It showed him standing on a beach during their vacation in Maine years ago. He was smiling widely, the wind moving through his hair, his arm wrapped around her shoulders. The memory hit her so strongly that she began crying before she even realized it. Ethan heard the sound from the living room and walked into the hallway. When he saw the photograph in her hands and the tears running down her face, he understood immediately. He didn't try to stop her crying. Instead, he gently took the photo, placed it back on the shelf, and wrapped his arms around his mother. For several minutes, she cried against his shoulder. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered between tears. "I don't know how to live without him." Ethan spoke softly. "Dad wouldn't want you to carry all this alone." Laura shook her head slowly. "He was my whole life." Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "He was a big part of your life," he said, "but he wouldn't want to be the end of it." Laura didn't reply. She wasn't ready to think about the future yet. But the words stayed quietly in her mind. As winter slowly turned into early spring, Ethan continued helping. His mother rebuilds a sense of normal life. He encouraged her to take short walks around the neighborhood, At first she refused. The idea of seeing familiar places without Daniel beside her felt too painful. But Ethan insisted gently. One afternoon, he handed her a light jacket and pointed toward the front door. "Just 10 minutes," he said. "Fresh air might help." Reluctantly, Laura agreed. They walked slowly down the quiet street together. The cold wind brushed against their faces, and the trees were still bare from winter. At first, Laura kept her eyes on the ground, avoiding the houses, where neighbors might wave or ask questions. But after a few minutes, she began noticing the small signs of life. Returning to the town, a dog barking happily behind a fence, children riding bicycles in a driveway, a couple laughing while carrying groceries. The world was still moving forward. That realization felt strange but also comforting. When they returned home, Laura felt slightly lighter. It was a small step, but it mattered. Over the next weeks, Ethan also started working in the garden behind the house. Daniel had always loved gardening. He spent hours planting flowers and trimming the bushes carefully. After his death, the garden had slowly become messy and neglected. One Saturday morning, Ethan walked outside with a pair of gloves and a shovel. Laura watched him through the kitchen window. For hours, he worked quietly, pulling weeds, trimming branches, and planting new flowers. By afternoon, the garden looked alive again. When Laura stepped outside to see it, she felt an unexpected wave of emotion. "Your father would love this," she said softly. Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead and smiled. "I learned from the best," he replied. Moments like these slowly helped Laura breathe again. The pain of losing Daniel didn't disappear, but it stopped controlling every second of her day. Then, one evening, something unexpected happened. Ethan suggested they clean the attic. The attic had been untouched for years. Old boxes, furniture, and family memories were stored there under layers of dust. "Maybe we'll find something interesting," Ethan said while carrying a flashlight upstairs. Laura followed slowly as they opened old boxes. They discovered pieces of their past, Ethan's childhood drawings, old holiday decorations, and forgotten photo albums. Some items made them laugh, others brought quiet tears. Then Ethan found a small wooden box hidden beneath a stack of books. "What's this?" he asked as Laura opened it carefully. Inside were dozens of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon she immediately recognized Daniel's handwriting. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the first letter. It was a note Daniel had written. During their early dating years, the words were simple but full of affection. He had written about how lucky he felt to meet her, and how he hoped their future would be filled with adventure and love. Laura smiled through her tears. "You used to write me letters all the time," she said. Ethan looked surprised. "Really?" Laura nodded. "Before phones and texting," she said with a soft laugh. For the next hour, they sat on the attic floor, reading the letters and looking at old photographs. Each memory reminded Laura that her life with Daniel had been full of happiness, not just loss. Eventually, Ethan spoke again. "You had a beautiful life together." Laura nodded quietly. "Yes," she said. "We really did." Ethan looked at her carefully before continuing. "But that doesn't mean your life is finished." Laura looked confused. "What do you mean?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Mom, you're still young." Laura laughed softly. "I'm 47. "That's not old," Ethan replied. Laura shook her head. "I can't imagine starting over." Ethan leaned back against a box and looked at the ceiling. "You don't have to start over tomorrow," he said calmly. "But someday you might want to try something new." Laura stayed silent. The idea felt strange and distant. But something inside her shifted slightly. Later that night, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror. For months, she had only seen herself as a widower, woman whose life had ended along with her husband's. But now she looked closer. She saw a woman who had loved deeply and survived something painful. She saw someone who still had years ahead of her. The thought was both frightening and hopeful. Downstairs, Ethan turned off the lights in the living room before heading to bed. As he walked past the family photographs on the wall, he paused in front of one picture of his parents smiling together. "Don't worry, Dad," he murmured quietly. "I'll take care of her." But neither Ethan nor Laura knew that within a few months something surprising would happen, something that would completely change Laura's life. And when she finally told Ethan about the decision she had made, it would leave him staring at her in total shock. Because Laura Mitchell was slowly discovering that even after losing the love of her life, her story was not over yet. Spring arrived in Vermont, bringing soft sunlight and a faint scent of flowers that seemed to drift through the air like a gentle promise. Laura Mitchell felt it in her bones. Something inside her had started to awaken. The long months of winter, the quiet nights, the weight of loss, all had begun to shift. Ethan's presence had been steady, a quiet anchor. But now Laura sensed a pull from within herself, a need to move forward, to breathe fully again. And maybe, just maybe, to embrace life beyond the shadow of grief. One afternoon, as Laura wiped the kitchen counters after cooking dinner, she realized she was smiling more often than she had in months. Even the act of chopping vegetables felt lighter. She looked at Ethan, who was setting the table, and saw the faintest hint of hope reflected in his calm eyes. They exchanged no words. They didn't need to. The understanding between them had grown strong, built from months of shared silence, shared memories, and small acts of care. Laura felt ready to take her first real step into life, again, not recklessly, but deliberately, with courage. It began with a thought that surprised even her. One evening, after putting the dishes away, she said, almost to herself, "Maybe it's time to make a change." Ethan looked at her, curious. "What kind of change?" he asked. She hesitated, then spoke in a voice that was both nervous and determined. I think I want to sell the house." Ethan blinked in surprise. "This house, Mom? All of your memories are here." She nodded, acknowledging the truth in his words. "Yes, but these walls hold a lot of pain too. I think it's time to find somewhere new, somewhere that feels like a fresh start." Ethan stayed quiet for a moment, letting her words settle. Then he asked, "Where would you go?" Laura took a deep breath. She had thought about it for weeks, but had never spoken it aloud. "There's a small cafe for sale near the lake," she said slowly, her voice almost a whisper. Ethan's eyes widened. "A cafe?" he repeated, disbelief mixed with a faint grin. Laura nodded, feeling a spark of excitement she hadn't felt in years. "I've always loved cooking, and maybe I can bring a little happiness to other people's days too," she explained. Ethan studied her, seeing the shift in her posture, the new determination in her gaze. Then he smiled, that familiar, gentle smile that reminded her of Daniel. "I can already imagine the sign," he said. Laura raised an eyebrow, confused. "The sign?" she asked. Ethan grinned, leaning against the counter. "Laura's second chance calf. It's perfect." Laura laughed, a sound that startled her because it had been so long since she had laughed freely. For the first time in months, she felt a flutter of hope, like the beginning of something entirely new. The following weeks were a whirlwind of planning. Laura and Ethan spent their days researching the cafe, talking to the previous owner, and imagining how the space could be transformed. Laura couldn't deny that she was nervous, but each day brought small victories. Negotiating a fair price, choosing paint colors, and deciding on the menu. Ethan stayed by her side the entire time, supporting her, encouraging her, and reminding her gently that this new adventure didn't erase the past, it simply allowed her to continue living. Then there was Michael Carter. Michael had been a friend of Daniel's from college, someone Laura had known in passing over the years. He had recently returned to town after years of working in Chicago, and when he heard about the cafe project, he offered to help. At first, Laura was hesitant. She wasn't sure if she wanted anyone else involved. And she wasn't ready for the kind of emotional closeness that Michael's presence might bring. But he was kind, respectful and genuinely skilled at renovations. Slowly, she allowed him into the process. Michael helped with the heavy work painting walls, installing shelves, fixing the counter, and even moving furniture. But over time, his presence began to feel comforting in a way Laura hadn't expected. They would laugh over paint spills, share meals in the cafe space, and talk about memories of Daniel, both happy and sad. It was different from the grief-filled conversations Laura had had with Ethan. Michael's presence was lighter, brighter, and yet deeply understanding. Ethan noticed it immediately. One afternoon, he walked into the cafe while Laura and Michael were moving a heavy table. He paused at the doorway, watching them. Laura's laughter rang out, light and unburdened, and Michael smiled at her with that quiet warmth that made her feel safe. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, and said simply, "You like him." Laura froze, caught off guard, her cheeks flushing. I didn't want to admit it," she said softly. Ethan's gaze softened. "Mom," he said gently, "Dad loved you more than anything. He would want you to be happy again." Tears formed in Laura's eyes. She nodded slowly. "You really think so?" Ethan hugged her tightly. "I know so," he whispered. That moment was transformative. Laura realized she could allow herself to feel joy again without guilt. She could remember Daniel and still find happiness with someone else. The renovation continued at a fast pace. Walls were painted, floors polished, tables and chairs arranged, and the menu perfected. Laura poured herself into every detail, rediscovering her love for cooking and creating a welcoming space for others. Michael was always nearby, offering help and advice, but also sharing laughter and small moments that made Laura feel alive again. Finally, the day arrived. The cafe was ready. The sign above the door read Laura's Second Chance Cafe, carved in warm wood with a delicate painted design. The town gathered, curious and excited, friends and neighbors filling the small space with chatter and smiles. Laura stood behind the counter, nervously adjusting a small apron, feeling a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Michael stood beside her, his presence steady and comforting, and Ethan watched from the corner with pride in his eyes. When the doors opened, the cafe filled quickly. People admired the cozy space, the bright windows, the homemade pastries, and the scent of fresh coffee. Laura moved among them, serving drinks and smiling, feeling the warmth of community wrap around her like a blanket. It was overwhelming in the best way possible. A neighbor leaned close, whispering, "Laura, this is amazing." "I didn't know. You had it in you." Laura smiled, feeling her heart lift. She realized then that the cafe wasn't just a business, it was her way of embracing life again. It was proof that even after loss, she could create joy, laughter, and connection. Michael stayed close, helping where needed, and Laura noticed how often their hands brushed. There was an unspoken bond forming, quiet but undeniable. She felt a spark she hadn't felt in years, a gentle warmth that made her pulse quicken and her heart hopeful. Ethan approached, smiling, and asked, "Do you feel strange, seeing your mom start over?" Laura looked at him, then at Michael, then at the bustling cafe filled with friends and neighbors. "Strange? No," she said softly, shaking her head. "It feels right." Ethan nodded. "Your dad gave you 23 beautiful years. Now you deserve more. You deserve happiness again." Laura's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they were tears of relief, gratitude, and hope. She hugged Ethan tightly. "Thank you for always believing in me," she whispered. As the sun set over the lake, casting a golden glow through the cafe windows, Laura realized the truth. She had chosen courage over fear, life over grief, and love over despair. She had allowed herself to dream again, to laugh again, and to open her heart. The decision had surprised everyone in town because many expected her to retreat into sadness forever. But Laura had chosen differently. By the end of the evening, as the last customers left and the lights dimmed, Laura stood at the door with Michael beside her. They shared a quiet smile, understanding that this was only the beginning of something beautiful. Ethan watched from the porch, knowing his mother had found her second chance. Laura Mitchell had been through unimaginable loss, yet she had found strength, love, and a new chapter in life. She had learned that grief did not define her, that memories could coexist with hope, and that it was possible to honor the past while embracing the future. And sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do after losing everything is to dare to live fully once more. The cafe, the town, and even Laura herself would never be the same, because she had chosen not to hide, not to grieve endlessly, but to step forward into the life she still deserved, and in doing so, she had shocked everyone, not with scandal, but with the power of resilience, hope, and love reborn.